You're now listening to the Engage the Rockies podcast, your go-to podcast for local and state issues concerning Colorado.
Hello, Colorado. This is the Engage the Rockies podcast. I am your host, Jarvis Caldwell, Executive Director of Engage the Rockies. Today, we're talking about something that is a very important issue, both locally and at the legislature, that maybe a lot of listeners aren't as aware of. You know, when we think of the legislative session and we think of the bills that happen up there, you know, we tend to hear a lot about the very controversial ones, like whether, you know, gun control or pro-life bills or pro-choice bills, things like that. But something that maybe people are less familiar with is the issue of local control. And so this is a major issue this year at the Capitol, and we'll get into why that is and what local control is. But to talk more about it, we brought on Representative Dawn Wilson. So Representative Wilson is a current representative for House District 20, encompassing the Air Force Academy, Monument, Glen Eagle, Woodmore, Palmer Lake, Black Forest, and Falcon. Representative Wilson is currently a candidate for El Paso County's Commissioner District 3. And before serving House District 20, Rep. Wilson was elected to the Town of Monument Board of Trustees in 2016 and served as Mayor Pro Tem until 2018, when he was elected Mayor of Monument, where he served through 2022. Representative Wilson, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jarvis. And around town, I still get a lot of that, Mayor Wilson.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you're in there long enough that it's easy to mix that up. And so the reason we wanted to have Rep. Wilson on is because of his background as being on the Board of Trustees at Monument and being a former mayor and now running for county commissioner. Local control is a very big issue in those positions there. And so because it is such a big issue at the legislature, and you may not have heard as much about these bills because it's, you know, not the controversial gun control type bills, he was the perfect guest to have on here. So to start off, we'll give a little bit of background from my experience at the Capitol from last year, which you were also there. That was your first session. So towards the end of the 2023 session, there was a bill that got dropped on legislators. It almost seemed like out of nowhere, and that was Senate Bill 23-213, the land use bill. Now, this bill had a lot of support from the governor. I can tell you that at the time, I remember the day they introduced this bill, I was sitting in the office up at the Capitol, and within a time span of about 10 minutes, I had 3 different reporters from different agencies local to Colorado come by my office and say, "Hey, are you guys going to be at the press conference the mayor's holding in a couple minutes?" And I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. And then a couple minutes later, the next reporter walked in, "Are you guys going to be at the press conference?" And I was like, okay, 3 people in 10 minutes asked me if we're going to be at the press conference for some big announcement that the governor's doing. And this is like, I don't know, a week, 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks before session ended. And I was like, I have no idea what they're talking about. So I walked outside, and on the steps of the Capitol, on the west side of the Capitol, I believe it is, there must have been 300 or 400 people there. And I was like, how in the world did we not know about this? And what it turned out to be was the governor's announcement of his land use bill, Senate Bill 213. And this bill was massive. I mean, it started off as 100-something pages. And then by the time it went through committee, it got cut down to 90 pages. And then there was a bunch of amendments, and it went back up to like 120 pages. And so ultimately in the Senate, literally in the last hours of session in the Senate, the bill died. And now I'm going to have you add to this here, Rep. Wilson, but what I believe is going on, what happened this session in 2024 is that massive, huge land use bill has gotten chopped up. Would you say that's kind of correct? It's gotten chopped up into individual bills through the 2024 session.
Yes, that's correct. I mean, they took bits and pieces here, tried to make
Mm.
it more palatable and less of a focal point. If you
Mm.
do little pieces here and there throughout the session, there's not going to be as many people taking note to some of these minor actions that add up to a lot
Mm.
versus one big bill. Like you said, that bill was around 100 and some pages last year. And with amendments, there was over 200 pages of amendments. So as that went through the session before it died, I don't think even the sponsors knew what was in the bill anymore because so much had changed on it. Luckily, that did die. It had a lot of pushback from communities,
Mm.
and so this year we saw portions of that coming through and making it difficult on local governments.
Yeah, and one of the big complaints that I remember from last year was that the local, whether it's city council members, whether it's county commissioners, whether it's mayors, there there was a lot of pushback because they felt like they were completely left out of the process. Now, and I remember you and now Minority Leader Rose Puglisi from the House Republicans. I remember that was a big issue for you guys. You guys were like, "Hey, this bill dropped out of nowhere. We had heard rumors maybe or something like that, but like we had no stakeholdering in this, and then you're going to drop this on us and try to ram it through in the last week of the legislature." Is that kind of a fair assessment? Like as far as how much input you guys had on it?
That is a very fair assessment. And you look at the makeup of our caucus, the Republican caucus in the House. Last year with 213, our caucus has two mayors, a county commissioner, a county assessor, um, all these experienced individuals, and we weren't invited a seat in the table. Finally, towards the end of session, uh, Minority Leader Puglisi and I were invited to a discussion with House leadership and the governor's staff. And we got to the meeting and said, hey, are our concerns going to be considered? And are we going to be able to negotiate? And the response from the governor's staff is they would be happy to hear our concerns, but no changes were going to be made. And minority leader, knowing and being strong, she said, okay, well, then we'll just leave and forget about this meeting. And we got up and left. There
Yeah.
is no reason for stakeholding. And we see that a lot in the executive branch, where stakeholding is with people you agree with and not with actual debate and policy with people that might not be on the same page.
Yeah, and I mean, for especially for bills like this that are so gigantic and are really going to fundamentally change the way Colorado development happens, you want to bring the other side. Normally, you want to bring the other side to the table and do that stakeholdering and get that back and forth. You don't just drop it on them and say, "Hey, here it is," and either you support it or you don't. Because again, like you said, you guys have a lot of experience there. And not only that, you guys represent a lot of very important areas around Colorado. For instance, you coming from northern El Paso County, right? Very big district. A lot of people are going to be affected by this. I mean, each one of our districts in the state in the House represents almost 100,000 people. And so the fact that you guys aren't being brought to the table, and then when you are brought to the table, it's really more or less like, here's the bill, uh, you know, good luck with it. Like either you like it or you don't like it. But it makes me wonder, because the fact that they didn't bring you to the table to write up, to help develop those 100-something pages, which for perspective for the listeners, any bill that's over 100 pages is a massive bill for a state legislature. I mean, most bills are like 10 pages or less. And so this was gigantic. And for the fact that, as far as I'm aware, not a single person from the Republican side was involved whatsoever in the drafting of this bill, it's kind of not a good look. And so getting to what we're going to kind of discuss now is this bill, like you said, Senate Bill 213 it got defeated last year. It got chopped up into a lot of different pieces. And those pieces went through the legislature, and some of those most significant ones have passed and have been signed into law. So that's where we'll start at here. So House Bill 24-1313, Housing and Transit-Oriented Communities. So Governor Polis signed this into law on May 13th, which was on Monday of this week. We're filming this on Wednesday, May 15th. So to give a short bill description for the listeners, this bill requires that certain local governments plan and implement housing density goals approved by the Department of Local Affairs, and creates a grant program and other technical assistance to support these efforts. Also, the bill requires transit-oriented communities submit a housing opportunity goal report to the Department of Local Affairs. Preliminary report is due by January 2025 and another by December 2026, and then 3 years after that. So I'll admit, Representative Wilson, transit-oriented communities, when I first heard that term, I was like, I have no idea what this is. Obviously, transit is a part of it, but what's a transit-oriented community? Kind of, what's kind of your take on this bill and the meaning of all that?
Right. I want to take a step back real quick, though, if we can, and talk about the importance of local control.
Yes.
Our state constitution is made up so that your local community has say over their area. Those are the people that know best of what's needed in your community. Those are the people elected by your community. It's that direct representation. And it's in our Colorado Constitution that, these powers are passed down to the local entities so that they can best address our needs in our area. It's not top down. It's not the state deciding what your community needs. And so that's an important thing to understand when you see bills like this and how they affect local communities. Is it's not supposed to work that way. It's supposed to be bottom up. The smallest community has their say on what goes on in their community. So transit-oriented communities, this is another kind of under the guise of housing issues. This is another bill to focus the development around transit areas. So we're talking light rail stations, we're talking bus stops, those kind of things. That's what they want to make a transit-oriented community. And so they're pushing higher density in efforts to basically part of their greening initiative to keep people from driving, to allow them to just walk out their front door and catch a bus or a light rail, or in the long run, we've heard a lot of discussion about front range passenger rail. Mm-hmm. And this bill focuses on basically 30 communities along the Front Range that might have access to transit, but that's not always consistent. And one thing it really goes against is, like I was saying, the community say. So people move to their communities a lot of times for the character of that community, the amenities they like or need or don't need. So in an area like Monument, it's not a big transit hub. We have one Mustang stop. It's not the feel. It's not the character of Monument.
Right.
So what they're pushing is kind of an urbanization of all areas along the Front Range, and that's not why people live here.
Right. Yeah. And so 2 points on there. Thank you for kind of giving us the background. I kind of skipped over that, but yeah, like the importance of local control. The way I think about it is like our federalist system of government, right? Like we don't have the State Board of Education or the federal Department of Education running our local school, right? We keep it as locally as possible. So we elect school board members like locally within our school district to make those kinds of decisions, right? And so because those are the closest representatives to us, and we can have the most change and effect on it. And so that's the importance of local control here in the terms of like development in our communities, right? What's good for Monument, what's good for El Paso County in general, what's good for Colorado Springs is not the same thing of what's good for Denver. Now, kind of what you're getting to here with the transit-oriented communities, if Denver wants to be like New York City, where most people don't own vehicles and you literally walk everywhere or take a subway or something, then Denver can do that, right? Like they can start developing around that. Their city, they have a city council, they have a mayor, they've got county commissioners. They can start developing Denver to be like New York City if they want to. But that shouldn't be forced on a town like Monument, right? That shouldn't be forced on Colorado Springs. That's not what those communities are.
Right. And we see that already in our communities. Right. I mean, we have some communities that you would think might be too small, but they have their own bus system. They have their own their ways of transit, and we have some communities that don't. And that's in some ways that's not by design. In other ways, it is by design. Yeah. So the community is able to do what they need, and the role of the state is to be in a support role.
Right. Yeah, and I think of this like utopian future, and I feel like that's what the governor and others who are pushing this kind of stuff want, where it's like you have a highway, you have a rail system, and then it's like nothing but like high-rise apartments that just line those up. So everybody's like sitting right on the train tracks, and everybody's sitting, right on the highway. And so they envision this community where you walk out of your high rise, and then you can, walk to a store close by or go get on the train and then go down to the other end of the high rise. It's like, it is almost like this utopian or I would call dystopian future where everybody's just, what they call it, is it 15-minute cities or something? I keep hearing this term 15-minute cities, and never actually looked into it, but I guess the idea is that you can get anywhere in the city within 15 minutes or something.
Right. Which a lot of times means things are just crammed together closer.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Making it easier to get from one place to another.
Yeah. And you touch on this, and I think this is a very common theme here that we'll see with these bills is that this is like, people shouldn't be mistaken here. This is not just about, oh, well, we just want you to build the way we want to build. Like there's an ideology behind this, right? Which is, you had mentioned, it's a green initiative. This is like, hey, if we build all these buildings on top of each other and we make everybody live within 15 minutes of each other, then that'll cut down on you having to drive a little bit further or something like that. Is that kind of what it seems like, what it feels like they're going with this?
Yeah, with all these bills, that was one of, that was brought up so many times on what the effort is there. And, Representative DeGraff had brought it up many times. What is the result? So we keep talking about, and I know we're getting a little off track here, but we keep talking about the greening initiatives. And the governor made it very clear that part of each of these bills was that reason. But there's no data on that. There's no data saying, hey, if you reduce this, it's going to decrease carbon by this much, or it's going to, help ozone by this much. There's nothing to that. And nobody seems to be able to answer that question. Right. So we throw that into every bill, I guess, as a need for feeling good about the environment, but it really does not do what they're claiming it's going to do. When we talk about transit, especially these transit-oriented communities, there was just an article in the Gazette or the Post about people aren't riding transit just because of crime.
Right.
It's not It's not just the convenience that there is a lot of transit that doesn't take you where you need to go, but it's also just the amount of crime that's going on transit. People aren't interested.
Yeah. Yeah, I lived in the DC area and something for a little while I was in the military, and they have a rail system there, and crime is definitely a problem there, and then also just reliability. Like I could have taken the passenger rail to work every day, but so every day when I was driving in, I would have the radio on, the local radio station, listening, and it was just, they did traffic reports like every 10 minutes or something like that, and literally every single day it was like, oh, this passenger rail is delayed because it's broke down or something like that, or there's some kind of issue with the tracks. I mean, it was an everyday thing, and so then they would have to bring in buses, right? So they're still they're still using, a form of vehicle transportation. They'd have to bring buses there to pick up people to then take them down to where the next stop would have been, or whatever. And it was very unreliable, because I remember thinking when I was driving in every day, like I because in the military they're pretty strict about being early and not being late, and I'm like, I could never rely on the passenger rail system there, because it was really rolling the dice on if you're going to be late for work or not, whether it broke down and running on time that day, and people need something reliable, and it's very reliable to go get in your car, leave a few minutes early, and then get there on time, and it's a lot more freedom too. Is reality. And if you look at how much money, because you could always say, well, maybe they just need to invest more in it, and it's like, no. Look up the metro system in the DC area. There is an insane amount, I mean, billions and billions of dollars a year dumped into that system, and it's unreliable. And again,
Well,
crime's always an issue.
and that's classic government. Let's
Right.
just throw more money at it and do more of it,
Yeah.
and claim that we're going to continue to fix the problem. And
Right.
we see this at the legislature with a lot of bills that are supposed to fix the previous bill that became a disaster or didn't work the way they thought they were going to work. Um, Along with these bills and the other local control bills, you see this push to solve a housing issue without taking into consideration what housing is already coming available and what is in the process. We completely neglect that. We don't talk about where our housing market is and what the obstacles are. That we're just going to fix the problem.
Mhm.
And again, we're going to keep throwing money at it and keep making laws to fix previous laws.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, before we move on to the next bill, I believe I was reading the Gazette this morning about 1313, the transit-oriented communities that we're talking about, and one of the requirements there is that there has to be 40 dwelling units per acre close to some kind of transit way or something like that, which,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I haven't done the exact math and looked up how much that is, but it sounds like what they're saying is basically you need to start building apartments and condos or something along every single major road or major railway is what it sounds like. Because how else do you get 40 living spaces within 1 acre? And I think the original bill 1313 was actually going to punish local, whether it was cities or counties, like if you don't meet this requirement for 40 dwelling units, like we're going to punish you by taking away money for like infrastructure or something like that. But it ended up getting stripped out, I think.
Right. So originally that was a huge concern is
Mm.
a lot of municipalities, I would say all municipalities, counties re- rely on their highway and bridge funds to do road maintenance to keep their community, the transportation in their community running well. And originally this bill laid out that you're going to lose those funds if you don't do this. Now,
Yeah.
you talk about the number of dwelling units and the distance from transit. This is a very touchy kind of concerning way of doing this, because here in Monument we have a Mustang stop, and this bill would require us to build apartments within, I think it's half a mile or something of that Mustang stop. So you build this, you have people move in that are reliant on transit. Nothing wrong with that. The problem is, we come to find out that they're ending that particular stop. So now what do you do with these residents that have moved in for transit, and that transit has been found to be ineffective, so they're going to end it?
Yeah.
They're going to end that stop, and now where are these people left?
Right.
Along with some of these other bills that create even more problems for those individuals in that situation.
Yeah. Okay. So that was just the first bill. So for the listeners, we're only going to cover, I think, 3 or 4 bills, and that was the first bill. But they're just so everyone knows, there are more bills than this that came from 213. We're just kind of covering the big ones that were signed into law here recently. So House Bill 24-1152, accessory dwelling units. This was also signed into law this week on Monday, May 13th. So this bill requires certain local governments to allow accessory dwelling units, also known as ADUs, and creates a certification and grant program for Department of Local Affairs to ensure local compliance and encourage the construction, conversion, and the use of ADUs. So ADUs, can you kind of simplify that for us, Rick Wilson, and explain what an ADU is?
Yes, this is a accessory dwelling unit. You do see these here and there with they used to be called like a mother-in-law pad or some addition to your house. A lot of people will renovate maybe above their garage to be an apartment for a family member. There's nothing wrong with ADUs. The problem is when you require that on local government. So when you move into a municipality or metro district or something, you kind of make a deal with them that, hey, you guys will handle water and sewage. I'll follow those rules that you need. You guys handle emergency services, and I'll follow those rules. Bills like this put an extra burden on the municipality or the county or whatever local government it is to meet requirements they're not in line to meet. So with an accessory dwelling unit, most communities have a process for it. They're in some way, they're allowable. If you're in a county and you're on your own water, you're on your own well and your own septic, most of the time that's fine, go ahead. The problem we run into is, especially with water in Colorado, is you're inviting additional residents, additional occupancy on what may already be an at-limit system or a strain system at that. So this bill allows for water concerns or sanitation concerns, but it puts enough restrictions on it that it's difficult to be able to work through it in a timely fashion. And what you want to see in a municipality, local government, is the ability of streamlining that stuff, not only to take the burden off the consumer, the person who's looking to do it, but also take the burden off the rest of the community when it comes to their resources and the things they depend on for their quality of life. When you start disregarding that and just saying, hey, you will allow this, it becomes problematic. And again, we go back to the character of a community. Right. People move to certain communities for certain amenities. This may not be something that, if this was something that did not exist before in your community, it might be something you don't want in your community, or it might be something you want certain stipulations on, which most of our communities already have. There are very few communities that that don't allow ADUs. Most of them allow them in some fashion. Now we're saying whatever your process is, throw it aside and write a new process that matches what the state wants.
Right. Which again, it comes back to the whole local control issue, right? Which is, communities like Monument or Colorado Springs or wherever, Falcon, they've planned out and developed in a certain way, and now the state's coming in and saying, like, hey, we know you spent all these decades planning and laying out your communities a certain way, but now we're going to add this on you, and there's nothing you can do about it, basically. And also in this bill, I didn't read this, but originally, but the bill prohibits subject jurisdictions from imposing new parking requirements or requiring that the ADU be owner occupied. So they made sure they jumped in there to deal with parking. So, if parking is an issue now, yes, sir.
Right, and I think we're going to get into some of the more of the parking issues here shortly. Yep. But when you're talking about the ability for law enforcement and the EMS to get around, and you start overcrowding the roads with parking, it starts to become an issue. It starts to create its own congestion.
Right, absolutely. And and I have kids here, and there's no restrictions on street parking, but everybody's pretty good. Most people have one or two cars only, and so there's enough room in driveways to do it. But you do go to some communities where maybe there's less parking space, and it's just the streets are filled with cars, and kids don't even have room to ride bicycles and things like that, just because it's very congested, and then it just overall kind of kills the character of the area. But again, it should go back to local control and what they want to allow or not. So we are getting into parking requirements. So there's two bills here. The last two that we're going to focus on as far as this local control goes, and that's House Bill 1304, which is minimum parking requirements, and House Bill 1007, which is prohibit residential occupancy limits. So these are obviously separate bills. I feel like they kind of go together in a sense that, again, it's state government telling local jurisdictions what they can and can't do. The parking requirements bill says it creates various rules and requirements concerning minimum parking requirements for local governments that are members of metropolitan planning organizations. So if I understand correctly, this is literally, it's pretty simple. It's just saying you guys can't, you can't set certain parking requirement amount limits. Is that kind of basically what it was?
Right. Originally, in its first introduced form, it banned parking minimums, parking requirement minimums, and basically left it up to the developer of a property to decide how much parking is needed, and of course, allowing them to push more parking onto street parking, which increases your code enforcement or parking enforcement. So that comes with its own cost. But and this is where we go back to local government having the ability to make their own decisions. When I first got on the board in Monument, we had some developments that we realized our parking requirement was too much. We didn't need to require that much parking. So what do you do as a local community? You adjust your ordinances to make it more appropriate to fit the need. But this bill says you're not capable of that. The state needs to do it for you. And again, one of the goals behind this bill is to lower housing costs, create more housing, because the development of that housing isn't spending as much on the parking piece of it. The problem is it doesn't work, and we see it in Denver. What ends up happening is the apartment or the dwelling might be a little cheaper with no parking, but they're going to take the little parking they have, and you're going to pay a premium for it.
Right.
So you see this in Denver all the time with apartments where, okay, your apartment's $1,300, $1,500 a month for a studio. By the way, your parking spot is going to be between $80 and $150 a month, additional onto that. So it lets the bill sponsors say, hey, look, you know, the dwelling unit is going to be this much cheaper, but the consumer is still going to be paying that extra cost. It's just going to be categorized different. And
Right.
again, this is another bill that is pushing towards transit. You know, if it's the more inconvenient you make it to own and use a vehicle, then the more people. The idea is that more people will have to go to transit-based schedule.
Yeah. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head right there, which is, the more painful it is to find a parking spot in a city or something like that, then the less you have to, the less you need to rely on it. And eventually you're just going to go, you know what? Having a car in Denver is just too much of a pain. And so I'm just going to get rid of my car, and then I'm going to try to live somewhere closer to railroad tracks or the subway system or wherever, a bus stop. And I think you're absolutely right there. I think it literally feels like it I don't know if you've ever been in New York City. My wife has family who lives in New York City, and I went there for the first time ever back, I don't know, it was like 2015 or something like that. And I was like, I'd never been to a city like that. It just blew my mind the way everybody lives on top of each other. You walk everywhere, like literally people just don't have cars. And I don't know, it's not for me. It's just sirens all the time. You're living in these high-rise apartments and you hear people above you all the time, or you hear people next to you through the wall, or you hear people below you. There's just always noise going on. And I'm like, you know what? I had that opportunity to live there, and I'm like, I don't want to live in that kind of community. And so I don't. But what it feels like the Colorado legislature is doing is saying, well, look, we're basically going to make everywhere New York City in Colorado before long. Like everybody's stacked together, and you have to ride the bus or the
Right.
subway.
And that's like I mentioned earlier. It's an effort to urbanize. I think when you expand the issues Denver has to other communities, then Denver doesn't look so bad.
Right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's a recruitment tactic, maybe. Okay, so the bill I mentioned, House Bill 1007, prohibit residential occupancy limits. So this was actually signed into law on April 15th. So this has been law, and I imagine it probably has a 90-day period before it technically takes effect. So this bill prohibits local governments, including home rule or statutory cities, counties, towns, territorial charter cities, and consolidated cities and counties, from limiting the number of people who may live together in a single dwelling, regardless of familial relationship. A local government may limit the number of inhabitants in a dwelling if the regulation is tied to demonstrated health and safety standards or affordable housing program guidelines. Okay. I mean, this sounds actually pretty straightforward, which is just you can't restrict how many people live in one single dwelling. Is that basically where it's at there?
It is. The one of the most frustrating things about some of these bills, and actually a lot of bills that go through the House, is this bill is based on two communities. I believe it was two. I think there was 4 municipalities that had occupancy restrictions, but only 2. I think it was only 2 of them that enforce them. And those 2 communities are college towns.
Yeah.
So needless to say, they created occupancy for quality of life for their residents. They did not want 20 college kids living in a 1-bedroom house, health and safety issues all over there.
Yeah.
And so we actually made a state law to cover the bill sponsors, made a state law to cover the whole state instead of DOLA working with those communities to find a better way of doing it, a process that worked. Instead, the state's just going to decide for you. Mm-hmm. And to that point, DOLA, on all these bills, these are items that DOLA could have been working with communities on as needed and where they saw the need for it versus creating a state law to require it. Right. I mean, the Department of Local Affairs, that's their job, is to work with communities to address their needs, to get where they need to go for their community. And all these bills we've talked about, that could have been taken care of in that aspect. But instead, we're making state laws about them. So the prohibit residential occupancy, again, we run into the water, sanitation, health, and safety issues. Do you have enough emergency service to provide for homes that may have more than expected? Do you have the water and sanitation? When we work on our water system and we decide how much we need and how we get it and what our build out's going to be, it's usually based off what's called an single family equivalent. Mm-hmm. And that basically gives you an average of what every house is going to need for water, what every house is going to need for sewage. And when you take away any sort of occupancy limits and just let it go for, however many people want to live in a house, then again, you're on one pipeline, probably for water and another one for sewer, that are built to meet the need of that single occupancy or single family equivalent, not for above and beyond that. So now you're talking about, again, infrastructure that's either already there or infrastructure that needs to be expanded. One of the cities on the Western Slope just ran into this where their sanitation district was just out of capacity. Mm-hmm. And it was going to cost multi-million dollars to expand that. It's a huge project to undertaking. If they couldn't have any sort of control, they could very quickly move into a health and safety concern because they don't have any ability to manage what is happening in their community. Mm-hmm. Now, this bill also gives an out for health and safety, mainly for water and sanitation, not for emergency services, I don't believe. Mm-hmm. But it requires it to go through CDPHE, the Department of Health. Yeah. That is another cumbersome, bureaucratic process. The way it's set up right now in my community, the sanitation department or the water department can come and tell the city council or the town council that there's an issue and we need to take these steps to mitigate the issue. In this bill, that process is made cumbersome by saying sanitation or water has to go get approval or prove that there's an issue to the Department of Health before the town council can address that issue. So we're creating more bureaucratic red tape for a local government to handle the issues in their community.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't have anything to add to that. I mean, you pretty much nailed it, which is, look, these communities are built with certain expectations in mind for how many people it's going to house and how many they can handle. And when you just take off any restrictions, now all of a sudden the infrastructure there is not in place to handle all these people. And I recall reading about those communities you were talking about. College towns. I think it was Fort Collins. I think maybe one of them that was one of these examples. But as you mentioned, it's like, hey, look, if this is an issue for college towns, and there's only 2 in mind or whatever, we'll let them handle it. That's local control, right? Like they can handle it. You don't need to force that on Monument and Colorado Springs and Pueblo and everywhere else, just because it's an issue that you're having with wherever, right?
Right, and capacity and quality of life does a lot to control this as is. You're seeing, this is not going to make some major breakthrough change in housing.
Right.
This is going to allow some people to take advantage of a situation, but at the end of the day, the numbers for housing that this bill is going to address is not going to be any sort of statistic that gets oohs and ahs.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, sir. We're on 45 minutes right now, and so those are the big local control bills. There is one bill I just really wanted to touch on with you, and it can be extremely brief. And this is because it is National Charter School Week this week, and you did sit on you do sit on the House Education Committee. So there was a bill that went through committee and thankfully was defeated, but it's the House Bill 24-1363, the Charter Schools Accountability Bill. Would you kind of agree with the assessment, which we had on Ross Izzard from Zepho Strategies, who works with the charter school community? We had him on when this bill was first introduced, and basically more or less he said that the way that this bill is written, it is written to intentionally basically kill charter schools in Colorado. Like, it's just there was no wiggle room. There was no, hey, can we work with you and amend this part or that part to make it a little less bad? He was like, look, this bill, the way it's written, is just straight up to try to end the charter school community. Would you agree with that assessment? And do you believe, because according to Ross, he was like, this bill is coming back. This bill sponsors made clear this bill is going to be coming back next year. Like, is this going to be a thing that you think we see next year?
So I'm not as fluent on charter schools as Ross is. So I will give the very basics.
Yeah.
He's clearly an expert in it, and I have a working knowledge. But yes, this bill was to kill charter schools, make it such a bureaucratic process that it just becomes too much.
Right.
And in this bill, we saw, one thing that really stuck out to me was the ability of a school district to impose a moratorium on charter schools if their public school, traditional schools are losing attendance.
Right.
So to me, that's almost its own contradiction. When
Right.
you're saying, when you have charter schools that clearly are doing better than your local public schools, and drawing students from public schools for a better learning experience, then you're saying that a public school district can say no to charter schools because of that competition, because there's that competition of who's giving the better education. So this bill was ridiculous. We have seen this. We saw this similar issues in the new school funding bill this year, where the teachers union, the school organizations are not in favor of charter schools, and they want to get rid of, for the school funding bill, it was wanting to get rid of the capital projects, building of charter schools funding.
Right.
So we are going to see this continued attack on charter schools. Our charter schools have done so well. We are blessed to, one of the few areas we agree on, we have a governor who does support charter schools. So I don't think anything is going to make it through in the next couple years that would be extremely harmful to charter schools. But that doesn't mean I don't think the attempt's not still going to be there. So we are going to continue to see this. Like I said, we even saw it in the school funding bill, or the new funding formula, this attack on charter schools. Don't want that competition. Don't want to, like we were saying with Denver, if we make other places as bad as Denver, it makes Denver look better.
Right.
Same thing with charter schools. If we make if we make charter schools look more like public schools, then public schools don't look as bad.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Even though charter schools are public schools, but the traditional public school.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. That's an important distinction there. It's like when people say, well, public versus charter, and it's like, well, charter is public, right? But it's easy I understand the category differentiation there. All right, Representative Wilson, we're going to leave it off there, sir. I think we broke our previous record of 47 minutes on one of our other podcasts. So we did run a little long, but I think this is the most important issue as far as local control. I think that's the most important issue that probably people think the less about. Obviously, if you're in this realm and you're in local politics and state politics, this is something that everybody talks about a lot. But just for your citizen who's just working and trying to survive, local control is not one of those sexy topics or whatever, if you will, that catches all the headlines. Again, like I keep using gun control as an example, because that's a lot of times you see the headlines for, but I think it's something that is not as known about, but is probably, if not the most important thing that needs to be talked about. So we really appreciate you coming on here and talking about this. I did mention that you are that you're a current representative and you're also running for County Commission District 3. If people want to know more about you, where can they go to find out more about you?
Well, thank you. And the whole reason behind that has to do with local control and being in touch with your community, being able to support your community as you need it. I can be reached at Wilson, wilsonforcolorado.com. Okay. And you can submit an email through there or reach out to me. Happy to talk to people, especially when it comes to local control and what your neighbors, your citizens want and need from their community. Absolutely.
All right, sir. Well, we'll have you back on sometime in the near future and see if the governor's utopia exists yet or not, or if it's just created more problems down the road.
Sounds good. Thank you, Jarvis.
Thanks, sir. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Engage the Rockies podcast, your go-to podcast for local and state issues concerning Colorado.